The will of the people, moreover, practically means the will of the most numerous or the most active part of the people. The majority, or those who succeed in making themselves accepted as the majority. The people, consequently, may desire to oppress part of their number. And precautions are as much needed against this as against any other abuse of power. John Stuart Mill, On Liberty, 1859.
Well, good morning. The folks at the Impact Fund wanted to start with a non-controversial topic so that you could ease into your day. And I'm very grateful that Christian and Trent and Kevin have agreed to join us this morning. I've worked with most of them, and I think we can have a quite illuminating discussion about where we stand with respect to election integrity a couple of weeks before the voting. Indeed, as the voting has already started. I wanted to begin by giving you a brief overview of where we are on some of the most significant issues here in Wisconsin. Last week, I had the privilege of arguing before the Wisconsin Supreme Court for the second time this year in front of my fireplace, because they're virtual, in a case where we seek to challenge the accuracy and the role of the Wisconsin Election Commission in maintaining the accuracy of the voter rolls. And I'm not going to get into the details, but essentially the issue is whether or not we should provide notice to people who have indicated to the government that they have may have moved from their registration address, and ask them to either confirm that they still live where they say they do in terms of their registration record, or remove that record from the voter roll. Unfortunately, the court is unlikely to act on that before the election, but I do think it illustrates something that's very, very important. And we argue a lot about in-person and absentee by mail voting. And the reality is that we're going to have a lot of absentee by mail voting in the 2020 election cycle. Here in Wisconsin in 2016, about 28% of the electorate voted absentee. Last spring, in April, it was over 70%. 34 states in the District of Columbia essentially permit no excuse absentee balloting. That is, you don't have to give a reason in order to vote absentee. And so it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. And it presents certain challenges because now we've taken the voting process and we've moved it almost entirely out of the supervision of election officials, right? Ballots leave election offices, they go to the voters, they are handled by the voters or perhaps other people. And this presents an even greater need to have a set of processes and procedures that ensure that this process, which is now not directly supervised to the same degree, happens in accordance with the law and in a way which does not present inordinate opportunities for fraud. Ballot harvesting is an issue that you may have heard of. This is the idea that a third party may request a ballot for a voter, help the voter fill out that ballot, and then return or not return that ballot once the voter has filled it out. We'll hear more about that from our panelists, I'm sure. Here in Wisconsin, the staff of the Wisconsin Election Commission has taken the position that ballot harvesting is legal. We believe that it is an occasion of political sin. And back in the day, Sister Mary Mel always taught me to avoid the occasion of sin, and so I do. And we did file a petition with the Wisconsin Election Commission asking them to clarify, because we believe that the law does not permit ballot harvesting here in the state of Wisconsin. They split 3-3 on the issue, as they always do. So if you are aware of any target, defendant, organization that intends to engage in ballot harvesting, please let us know. Finally, you've heard about the decision by a Madison District Court to extend the deadline by which ballots were required to be returned to election officials. If you open up the law books, state law says that that must happen by 8 p.m. on election night. Judge Conley in Madison has extended that, along with a few other things. And there's been a very complicated set of legal maneuverings that have followed that. The Republican Party in the Wisconsin legislature attempted to appeal his decision to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals immediately stayed, that means suspend, Judge Conley's order, and but then indicated that it would dismiss or that it would lift the stay because it believed that the Republican Party did not have standing to pursue the claim. It had not been ordered to do anything. And because it believed that the Wisconsin legislature could not represent the state of Wisconsin, even though, and this is important, even though Attorney General Call has declined to do so, claiming to have some type of a conflict. The court then backtracked a bit. It certified the question in the Wisconsin Supreme Court, because whether the legislature can do this is a question of state law, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what state law permits. And they certified the question to the court. There was briefing over the weekend. Fortunately, the Packers had the Monday night game, so it didn't get in the way. And earlier this week, midweek, the Wisconsin Supreme Court clarified that the legislature did have the ability to pursue this appeal and defend the law as it is written. Yesterday, a split panel of the Seventh Circuit reinstated the stay of Judge Conley's decision, and now the case will proceed. But for right now, the law is back on again, if you will. So there are many other issues here, but those are some of the major issues in Wisconsin. But now let's find out what's happening around the world. Christian, what's the left up to? Can you tell us what's going on in this area?
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and very humbling. Let me answer your question by going back about 12 years. Because that's where the story, once upon a time, we had elections and no one thought about this stuff. You just voted and things came out okay. When I was at the Justice Department in the voting section about 12 years ago, all I did is election law. So I'll never forget, after the inauguration in 2009, Eric Holder came to my office. We all met in the conference room. And it was clear there's a new sheriff in town and things are going to be handled differently. And the first way we saw that is there was a decision made inside the Justice Department to not enforce the law related to voter roll cleanup under NVRA Section 8. And we had been enforcing the law, which says you have to reasonably keep your rolls clean. And suddenly it was shut down. It was very peculiar because that's not how things are supposed to work. At the time it seemed unusual. Those of you who lived through 8 years of Obama are probably no longer surprised by this sort of thing. But I also saw it when I did the new Black Panther case, when we sued Philadelphia, or we sued the new Black Panther Party for having people in front of the polls with nightsticks. And we filed that before the inauguration, and after the inauguration, it was kiboshed, essentially. And that was what ultimately made me decide to go into the private sector. But putting that aside, the theme is that the law became an option and a suggestion, not a rule, when it came to election process. Now, what do I mean by election process? These are the things we used to not worry about. It's how the voting occurs, how the ballots get counted, early voting, vote harvesting. And I'll tell you a few war stories about voter fraud. But one I want to talk about is ballot harvesting, because I've met the real victims to this. When I was at the Justice Department, I did a case called United States versus Brown in the Southern District of Mississippi. And ballot harvesting was how you won elections there, right? Whoever had the notaries collect the most ballots won. And we had to knock on about 100 doors. And Mr. Olson in the last panel said, you need to be documenting this thing now regarding voter fraud. Well, let me tell you something. I've been on the front lines of this. You can't do it that way. It's a difficult slog even after the election when I have a badge to do it. Because we would have to knock on doors and say, did you get visited by these people? And then develop a relationship with the victim. And they would tell you how it worked. One particular lady named Susie Wood, I want to tell you about. Susie was having her ballot voted by somebody else on her kitchen table, election after election after election. The notary would come to her house, vote the ballot, take it away. We put Susie Wood up in federal court on the stand in the trial in this case, and she was telling her story. And you know what? She kind of liked it. Like, she didn't seem to have any problem with it. And the federal judge, Judge Tom Lee in the Southern District of Mississippi, stopped the trial and asked a question. Doesn't happen a lot in trial to have the judge begin to ask questions of the witness. And he said, Ms. Wood, why on earth did you let this person vote your ballot? And she said, well, Judge, Carrie Kate was the ballot hard, Carrie Kate Wyndham. Carrie Kate always knows who the best person to vote for is. You see? So that's the dynamic of power that's going on in these places where ballot harvesting occurs. The next thing, the other thing Mr. Olson talked about, and I just, if you'll indulge me for just a minute, we just did this report called Critical Condition. By the way, your support and the support of Bradley has been so important for us being able to do things like this and to really start to change the narrative of voter fraud. We were able to gather the voter rolls from the entire country, which is no small feat. And we normalized them into one central database, which is no small feat. This is what the president, when he appointed me to the Commission on Ballot Integrity about 3 years ago, I guess, we were going to do until we got sued out of existence. And we began to, you can only find voter fraud usually through data, through looking at who's voting in multiple states, who's voting after death. And for example, this database allowed us to find a man in Pittsburgh named Rashawn Slade. Rashawn Slade from Swissvale, PA, was registered to vote not twice, not 4 times, not even 6 times, was registered to vote 7 times in Pennsylvania. And there's lots of cases like this. I'm just giving you my favorite one. And Rashawn Slade was registered to vote like every other day before the 2016 presidential election. Like, they came to register him to vote every other day. We have cases like Harris County, Texas, which we just filed a petition to the Supreme Court today in Texas. They have been registering people to vote in Texas that when they fill out their voter registration form, the question is, are you a U.S. citizen? They're answering no, and they're getting registered to vote anyhow and voting. And so we collected all of this data. Remember, this goes back to, it's very difficult to get this in real time. We collected this data, and we're filing a petition in the Supreme Court of Texas to have them put an end to this behavior. The left has been focused on this issue for 20 years, and they have outpaced us for 20 years. They have built in structures and vulnerabilities, whether it's through motor voter, litigation. They literally have a war chest of hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with this, if not more, actually. Maybe somebody else will cover this, but the Center for Technology and Civic Life has come up with tens of millions of dollars to fund election offices around the country, including Madison, Racine, I think, Milwaukee, but they're also doing Philadelphia, Delaware County, Detroit. All these places are giving private philanthropy to do left-wing goals inside election offices. Now, when I tell that story, most people can't even understand what I'm talking about because it's so crazy. They're giving private dollars into government agencies to achieve policy goals they could not get through the legislature. And they're putting people on the ground in Philadelphia, for example, right now, to drive vans around who work for these third-party C3s to collect ballots, and sort of like Weekend at Bernie's, they have an election official in the back of the van just hanging out, so it's legal. You see? It's things like that that are occurring all over the country this election that we had never anticipated before, because the left is so focused on process, and they're so focused on pouring philanthropy into process to game the system to get the results they want. Now, some people say, well, that's voter fraud. They are even smarter than that. And I'll close on this. They have built a system where they can change the rules of the game so it's actually not voter fraud, it's just diabolically genius. And that's what they have done this year with COVID, with litigation all around the country, 170 lawsuits to change the rules of this election. Rick was talking about some of the things you're seeing here in Wisconsin. It's happening all over the country. And so the left has been very focused on philanthropy to alter the rules, build in chaos, and get results they want through changing process. So thank you all very much. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions.
Kevin, Christian has sort of described his efforts, which I think are tireless, trying to assure ballot integrity across the country. But what can states do? What type of reforms can be enacted to make this type of mischief less possible in years to come?
Well, there's a lot. And by the way, good morning. Thanks for having me. And what a privilege to be here with you, Rick and Christian and Trent, given all the work you've done on this issue. Let me draw back just a little bit and create an even worse or better sense of the worst case scenario. I happen to think voter fraud is a much bigger problem than our wonderful friends mentioned this morning, which was a terrific panel. And the reason I do is because I have the privilege of waking up each day in Texas. And let me just tell you, having spent the better part of 2 decades in education battling leftists, this would be blunt, but you might expect it from a guy from Texas. The left is in the process of succeeding in stealing this country. Not just stealing elections, but stealing the very ideal of what it means to be America. And because at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we're neither summer soldiers nor winter soldiers, but year-round soldiers, we decided in January of this year to start preparing for this problem. Now, we're able to stand on the broad and heroic shoulders of Christian Adams, and as soon as we're done, that's heartfelt, my friend, as soon as we're done with this panel, in fact, we'll be on the phone with our general counsel and our policy lead on this issue, dealing with that pressing problem in Texas. But let me just tell you, before I get to the reforms, Rick, if you don't mind, what the extent of the problem is in Texas. And keep in mind, I'm an optimist. The first problem is a longstanding cultural tradition in Texas of ballot harvesting. And the Spanish word is a politiquero, which is Spanish for political operative. They are going in as the third party and registering people to vote and intercepting their ballots and voting for them. Christian has unearthed some of this. We have unearthed some of this, especially in the spring primaries in Texas. We had to hire a dozen private investigators to do so. I would guess that probably half of them ended up being on the other side. But this is the kind of thing you do when you're just trying to fight guerrilla warfare against a very well-funded problem. And we unearthed a lot of problems. So let me relate 2 stories and then I'll talk about reforms. The first was the Democrat district attorney in Starr County, which is one of the counties right on the Mexican border, Omar Escobar. No relation to Pablo as far as I know. Omar came to us and said, you folks at TPPF need to help. We're just getting killed with ballot harvesting. And so we went in and did a video featuring Omar Escobar. You can see it on our website at texaspolicy.com. And he was so good, and he was so truthful, and frankly, so heroic, that the Democrats took him out in the spring primary using ballot harvesting and voter fraud. Second story, someone whose name I will leave anonymous, is a young lady some of our folks came across, Hispanic lady in Harris County, that's where Houston is, used to be a fairly red place. Well, it's probably purple if everything is honest, but it's turning blue because everything is dishonest. She said that a politiquero walked up to her house and said, ma'am, I need you to sign this. She said, what's this? I do this myself. And the politiquero said, well, I'm trying to hit my quota. She said, well, what's your quota? 500 ballots. And the lady said no. But she's unwilling, unlike her counterpart in Mississippi, to show up in a court of law because this is a system of power. And my point is, this is not a problem with Spanish-speaking people, not suggesting that at all. It's a problem there. It's a problem in white districts. I'm just as concerned about the suburban county where I live north of Austin, Williamson County, Collin County, and the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. for those places being rife with ballot harvesting as I am any other place in Texas. The second problem is mail ballots, period. In Texas, the law is very strict. You need to be over 65 or disabled or provide really good evidence that you're out of town. And we have an early voting system in Texas, which works very well. So 2 examples, and there are many, but I'll give you 2. In the 2018 election in San Marcos, where Texas State University is, very, very big campus, they were taking advantage, the other side was taking advantage of all of those students, and they were claiming that those students were in fact disabled or over 65. And so we had, which is not the case. These are very traditional students aged 18 to 22. We had several thousand more votes cast in that precinct than there are registered voters. What did the leadership in Texas, other than our attorney general, do? Not a thing. So part of the problem is cowardice on our side. Second example is back to Harris, which is led by a county executive who is a Marxist. I know you think that I'm being alarmist. I'm not.
He's not.
I'm a historian, just telling you the facts. They're ugly. 32,000 more votes were cast than there are registered voters because of mail-in balloting. And that's before COVID. So what we're facing here in a month, folks, is a profound problem. I think we're going to be able to fix it with legislative reforms. We're now going to be joining Christian with our litigation center to offer him some help from our wonderful attorneys who usually do just small things like try to end Obamacare. We're arguing that case, by the way, after the election, and it's my dying wish, if I die today, that Justice Barrett actually make the decision rather than Justice Ginsburg. But to stick with this, we're focused on legislative reforms. We need more centralized authority in Texas. That's, I know, sounds strange coming from a conservative, but the Secretary of State in Texas as an office, not thinking about a particular person, is a very weak position. And that position needs to have more authority. And we also need people in that position, frankly, who are willing to enforce the rule of law. And so we've gotten into this issue knowing that the problem is right in front of us. We're going to be fighting in the courts. We're going to be fighting in the legislature, which is sort of the reason for our existence. And I think that while the reality is very ugly, we are also optimists. And I think that we will be able to mitigate some of the troubles that we're having. And in a subsequent comment, I'll give you an example of some of the troubles we're having. But I think that we're going to live through a few months of a serious amount of voter fraud that will alter U.S. House and Texas House races in 4 weeks.
Well, thank you. I used to be an optimist. And you know, that's an important point that Kevin makes. I mean, we typically think about the presidential election, and we talk about voter fraud, and we say, oh, is it going to be close? Are Trump and Biden going to be close? But there are a lot of elections in the country. There are House races, there are Senate races, there are local races where, you know, the margins are just proportionately smaller, and this becomes a very, very important issue there as well. And thanks to Kevin for reminding us. Trent, we've talked a lot about the process of voting and what we need to do to maintain ballot integrity, but who we vote for and how we select a president is also very important. And you've been doing yeoman's work on the threat to the Electoral College. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thank you, Rick. And I have to start by thanking the Bradley Foundation and the Bradley Impact Fund. You know, these issues, all these issues we're talking about, are very popular right now, but very challenging to work on most of the time. And I'm not quite sure why that is. The left, ironically, James Madison is one of my heroes, but the left is so much more Madisonian than the right in understanding that if you control the rules, if you rearrange the structures and the institutions, you're going to get your way in the end, right? They get that. You know, as Christian mentioned, they've been working on these things for 20 years, right? And the Bradley Foundation has really been a leader in trying to help our side wake up to that fact, right? I mean, for Pete's sake, we on the right who revere the Constitution should understand just how important all of these rules and structures are. And I've been interested in the Electoral College going back to the 1990s, which is to say before it was cool, or regarded as really interesting. And that's thanks to Michael Ullman, who actually had an affiliation with the Bradley Foundation, but he was a professor of mine in the 1990s, and back in the 1970s, he was on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff, the United States Senate Judiciary Committee staff, when they last heard a proposal to abolish the Electoral College, because even back then you had folks, some on the left and some other folks actually, working to try to abolish the Electoral College through what at the time they thought was the only way that you could do that, which was amending the Constitution. Well, and Michael Ullman actually helped to, as a junior staffer, helped to stop that by writing a brilliant report, still one of the most brilliant things ever written about the Electoral College. But fast forward to 2000 and the Bush v. Gore election, and I think probably all of us in this room, or almost all of us in this room, were around for that election, and obviously the left was very unhappy, and on the and there was talk on the left about how are we going to get rid of the Electoral College, and I think those of us on the right, very sort of logically at the time, thought it's just the left tilting at windmills and they'll go away. The problem is nobody told the left that. And a trio of law professors came up with an idea. What if we got states to pass a law that changes how presidential electors are selected, just ignores the will of the people in your own state, and instead appoints presidential electors based on the national popular vote? Well, if you think that through, right, if you get enough states to do that, you can effectively hijack the Electoral College process and force it to rubber stamp the national popular vote result. Now, I mean, again, I am not one to sort of poo-poo the left, right? I mean, and I think all of us up here have recognized these people are serious and they're smart. And they looked at the Constitution, and there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly says that you can't do this. Now, there are some reasons why I think it's unconstitutional. But there's nothing, I mean, it's an idea so dumb, James Madison never worried about it, right? The idea that state politicians would just give away all of their state's voice in presidential elections, it's preposterous, right? They didn't have left-wing ideologues around in 1787. And a fellow who had been an Al Gore presidential elector in California named John Koza came across this idea. There are plenty of bad ideas that percolate around in the legal academy. But John Koza's previous claim to fame had been that he invented the scratch-off lottery ticket, the algorithm behind it, really. He's a mathematician from Stanford, and he's also one of Nancy Pelosi's top donors, and he was, as I mentioned, a big supporter of Al Gore. And he came across this idea, and he, again, was smart enough to recognize that the left was not going to win on a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College anytime soon, but that this idea might succeed or might push the debate so far, as happened in the lead up to the 17th Amendment more than 100 years ago, which I think is previously the worst constitutional change that we have done, that they threw so much sand in the gears that finally people threw up their hands and said, fine, we'll give you a constitutional amendment. We'll cut the state legislatures out of having any power in the federal system. And so the left has this sort of two-track strategy: either directly hijack the Electoral College through this national popular vote law, or throw so much sand in the gears that ultimately people say, we just need clarity, let's change the Constitution. Right. And if they ever, ultimately they have to get there, because what they want is to federalize all of this, all of these problems playing out in the states. They want to federalize all of this, control it from Washington, D.C., and force California style election laws on the entire country. That's if you sort of read what the left writes for themselves, right? That is the long-term agenda here. But to do that, you really need to get rid of the Electoral College. Besides the fact that it would obviously help the left win elections, as we heard in the last panel, right? The Democratic Party has become today like the Democratic Party was back in the 1870s and 1880s, right? They were at that time a regional party. That's the last time there were a couple of elections within a couple of decades where the candidate who received the most popular votes did not win the Electoral College. Why was that? It's because the Democrats had become a regional party after the Civil War. They could win 84% in South Carolina, right? They could win 70+% in a number of deep South states. What are they today, right? They're a regional party. It's not one region of the country. It's the big cities, right? They can pump out 80, 90% in some of these very blue cities. They're a regional political party. The Electoral College says that's not good enough, right? James Madison stood up on the floor of the Constitutional Convention and said, hey, I like the idea of a popular vote, right? Simple, it's easy to explain, but it would turn over control of the executive branch to the high population areas. That's a bad system because it freezes everybody else out. We've got to do something else, and that led to the creation of the Electoral College, right? Despite the fact that, it seems like every pundit today says it was like either because, they didn't have the internet or because they were all racist. And no, the rationale to create the Electoral College in 1787 is exactly the rationale for why we should keep it today. And everybody in this room, I think, looking at the election results over the last couple of decades recognizes that. But today, this National Popular Vote Compact has been passed by 15 states. They have 196 electoral votes committed to it. It takes effect if they get 270 electoral votes worth of states in the compact. When I started Save Our States back in 2009, we had done the math, and they were actually on track to put this into effect before the 2016 election. They had been winning states at that rate. And they had also been, they got this through the Arizona House of Representatives once. They got it through the Oklahoma State Senate once before I lived there in Oklahoma. They have made inroads even with Republicans because a lot of Republican consultants see dollar signs when they think about shuffling the deck in presidential politics. And like California Republican consultants tend to like this idea because they get 10% on TV buys in LA, right? And so they don't care about the Constitution and long-term stuff. They care about their pocketbook. This is a very, very dangerous fight that has been going on now for over a dozen years. We heard this morning, we could have a replay of 2016. And if we do that, this fight is just going to go into hyperdrive, right? The fight over the Electoral College. And even if it doesn't, frankly, even in 2009 after Obama had won, the left was still pushing this. They were still winning states. We have to defend the Electoral College, not just for some short-term political gains, but so that people like Kevin and people like Christian can actually fight these fights for election integrity in the states and keep it from being just swamped by a federalization of elections. So thank you all for being here. And again, thank Bradley for being so forward-thinking to focus on these kind of structural issues, right? This is, if you could bring James Madison up here, he would want us to have this conversation, right? And to be focused on these kind of issues. And so I'm just privileged to be here.
Well, thank you, Trent. I think that the point about the parallel with the late 19th century and Democrats being a regional party is significant. And I was reminded of one of our morning panelists, Henry Olson. He actually knows the names of the WOW counties. And if the Electoral College would go away, I'm not certain that we would get the kind of attention in the future that we get today. Christian, you talked about 170 lawsuits that are pending across the country, and that's a lot. How are we doing?
Well, pretty poorly. I'll share some examples. What are the fights over? Early on with COVID, they decided on the left to turn this into an opportunity to get rid of all these laws they don't like in states. Among them are the idea that you actually should vote at a precinct. Now, I can understand some people don't want to vote in person, so that's why you had this enormous push toward vote by mail. Okay? Some states enacted vote by mail by edict, like Nevada. Nevada didn't have a statute that said you can vote by mail, but the Secretary of State, through emergency powers, and the governor, through emergency powers, said we're going to turn our election system that's in the law into something we like better. And so that's why they did automatic vote by mail in Nevada for the primaries. They've since passed a law, but in the primaries, they mailed ballots to everybody, even if they didn't ask. So we got some data on this. Clark County, Nevada, which is Las Vegas. 1.3 million ballots were mailed out in Clark County. 224,000 bounced back as undeliverable because the voter rolls are bad. That's what I talked about earlier. The voter rolls are bad in Nevada. 330,000 ballots came back out of 1.3 million. 330 actually came back. Of those, 7,000 were rejected outright as defective. That's why I've been saying since the spring that vote by mail disenfranchises people. The president appointed me in August to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and we actually got to vote on a report recommending vote by mail. Because of my arrival, I was the deciding vote to reject it, because vote by mail disenfranchises people. It's a fact. And even NPR is starting to realize that now. Go back to the lawsuits. The left has been succeeding in bringing collusive litigation. They sued Virginia, for example, League of Women Voters versus Commonwealth of Virginia. And we filed an amicus brief in that case opposing this edict, this effort to change the elections in Virginia. I'll never forget, we had a conference call with Judge Norman Moon in the Western District of Virginia. And the plaintiffs and the defendants loved each other, right? It was collusive. The left-wing attorney general, the left-wing governor of Virginia wanted to get rid of all these state laws, and so did the plaintiffs. So we had a conference call, and the judge asked the parties, asked the attorney general, do you all ever plan on filing a responsive pleading in this case? Meaning even putting up any fight at all. And the answer is no. And that's what's happening all over the country. Let me flip the script a minute, just a brief moment. A lot of people have tried to file offensive litigation. Now, what I mean by that, attacking vote by mail, trying to say that a certain procedure, such as Pennsylvania's Supreme Court ruling, is somehow illegal. I took the approach early on, at least at our organization, the Public Interest Legal Foundation, that these cases are almost always doomed to fail. And they're almost always, and they, by the way, they have been failing. That's the other thing. All of the efforts to attack these changes, these emergency COVID changes, have failed. Not one single one has succeeded. And it's depressing. It's depressing because, the left is winning and our side is losing. And that's in part because of the judges, and it's in part because of the atmosphere that has been created around COVID. I will never forget how scared the judge was in these hearings to actually have in-person voting. So the personal views of the judges are often coming into the cases. One quick note about what Trent said. You guys might cover this, but where our issues totally overlap, if you have national popular vote, all that voter fraud in Detroit and Philadelphia and Milwaukee and Los Angeles, it's like bad ground beef, right? Once you have a wee little bit of bad ground beef, it infects the whole batch. All that voter fraud in those centers of voter fraud are going to become part of the national popular vote. We can isolate Philadelphia voter fraud now in the Electoral College. We can isolate it in Detroit to some extent. But once you go to national popular vote, it infects the whole batch. So that's the other reason not to support it.
The time for questions is about to begin. I'm sure that there will be a few. I have always thought that there was a margin of fraud, and that fraud was the biggest problem when an election is very, very close. And of course, we have very, very close elections. I used to teach election law in law school, and I used to refer back to the recount in Florida in the year 2000. And the recount that was not completed because it could not be completed on time or in a fair manner, was completed by a media consortium. And then for a while, the New York Times had an interactive website, which you could decide how you wanted to count the votes. Did you want to count pregnant chads, if you remember that? Did you want to count hanging chads? And in one of the most plausible scenarios for a counting methodology, George Bush won the state of Florida by 2 votes, right? Some guy got up, walked into the polling place, scratched his head, and decided who was going to be president of the United States, if that's the way it went. And so that is significant, both with respect to not dismissing this. But Kevin, when I hear you talking about Texas and that fraud could be significant in the state of Texas, a boy from Wisconsin thought that if any place was safe, it would be Texas. But I'm wrong, right?
Unfortunately, you are. You might be safe from protesters because we still have more guns than people, which is saying something. But yes, so let me put a little bit of texture on that. And I'm sure we want to get to questions, Rick, from our audience friends. I can think of 4 specific U.S. House races. Texas 23, the Will Hurd seat, runs along the border. That's probably been won by fraud before. That's going to be within half. The outcome will be within half of 1%. We're estimating, because we're doing some of the data work that Christian referenced earlier, that fraud could account for up to 1.6% of the votes in Texas. I think that that's conservative, actually, because we don't know the full effect of COVID regulations, these new COVID laws, right? Probably will affect, hopefully not the outcome. Our former TPPF colleague, Chip Roy, greatest member of Congress, no offense intended to anyone else. That's a very tight race with Wendy Davis, who's infamous in Texas, at least in some circles. And then every single Texas House and U.S. House race in Harris County is going to be affected, because that's really where ground zero is, even beyond the Rio Grande Valley. So let me say what we've been trying to work on and this new front of the battle, and then I'm sure we'll move on to questions. We do a lot of message testing to figure out on the front end how we can shame people into not participating in this sin. I actually think referring to this as a political sin is great. And the dogma lives loudly in us, so we're all about rooting out sin. You can tell we love justice, hopefully future Justice Barrett. So we do this message testing. We figure out how to persuade people. And then we do some radio ads. We did some Spanish language billboards in the primaries. But you can't really come back to people who are supporting you and say, this is the effect we have. You can, however, do that with digital campaigns. And so we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on digital campaigns, because we can say, this is the reform we want. This is the message we sent. These are the specific individuals we reach. It's just like what political campaigns do. We're a C3, so we're talking about issues, and this is the effect. So Facebook should be very happy to have us as a customer. But yesterday, just as I was arriving here, we get notice that this ad, which read this way, is offensive to the legitimacy of the US election. This is what we say. The coronavirus pandemic is upending our lives. That's true. But we can't let it undermine confidence in our elections. The progressive left argues that expanding mail-in voting is not fraught with risks. They say voter fraud is a myth, very rare, and claim it is almost non-existent. But you know, an all-mail election would be rife with fraud. And then we go on to invite them to take a survey. That's it. They're not allowing us to run this. That's an example, and we'll deal with this. They're going to learn today they picked the fight with the wrong people. And we'll get this fixed. But this is the problem, is that there are a lot of people wanting to step up, like Christian and Trent and Rick and all of you. And one of the tools we have at our disposal as conservatives is to do this rifle shot digital campaign, which is very effective in the political realm and in the policy realm where we exist. And they're beginning to kneecap us from doing that. That's what makes me a little more of an alarmist this morning.